Bold and raw perspectives of local politics. Important information which impacts our community, nation, and world. Exposing truth, transparency, and getting to the heart of relevant issues that you just won't see in the clickbait media. And always keeping it real. It's the Michelle Tanner Podcast.
But I won't back down.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining the Michelle Tanner Podcast today. First, I do want to give a couple of shout outs to our sponsors. First, we have the St. George Sunrise Market every Saturday from 9 a.m. to 1 p.m. They are amazing. Bring the whole family. There's fresh produce from farmers. There's artisans. There's artwork. There's activities for kids. There's line dancing. So please check them out, St. George Sunrise Market. Also, Bella 2 Medical, that's BELLA-TU Medical here in St. George for all of your wellness and aesthetic needs. They do all things from facials, from IV therapy, high-dose IV vitamins, boost your immune system, telemedicine visits. If you're acutely sick or just wanting a consultation, a second opinion, definitely check out Bella 2 Medical. Again, that's BELLA-TU medical.com. All right, let's jump into today's episode because we are fortunate enough to have Phil Lyman, Utah's next governor. I'm just going to say it. I am going to project that into the universe because I can't tell you guys how bad. Yes, we need Phil Lyman to be Utah's next governor. So Phil Lyman, I know you are running around like crazy these days. So thank you for taking the time to be on today.
Oh, it's a pleasure and an honor to be on, Michelle. Always. Thank you.
Thank you. And yeah, so you were on once before with Riley Gaines. Thank you for bringing Riley Gaines. I think a lot of people saw that episode as well. And to me, that really speaks to what you stand for, that, you know, Riley Gaines was here to back you up and endorse you. What was that experience like, you know, going around the state and speaking with Riley Gaines?
You know, I was really surprised, pleasantly surprised when I met Riley because she's so down to earth, so honest and sincere and brave, and everything that you know that kind of her persona is. She's that in real life, and then some. Super nice person. Still texts me kind of out of the blue, you know, to see how things are going, and that was a really good experience for me to spend a few days with Riley.
That's awesome. And yeah, I mean, one of the big frustrations, I think, for a lot of Utahns, that we've had several frustrations with our current governor. That's not a secret. That's why we need Phil Lyman in there. But he did veto the bill to keep boys from playing out of girls' sports. In fact, right before we went on air, I was having a conversation with a couple of gentlemen who are going on the radio in the room right next door, and they asked who I was having on today, and you know, I told them who they need to vote for, and they said, "Oh, well, why? So what's wrong with our current governor?" All I had to say was, "Do you think boys should be competing in girls' sports?" I was like, "Nope. Okay. All right. Check. We know that's not our guy." But aside from all of the negative things that many of us have experienced over the last 4 years now, I also want to talk about what makes Phil Lyman the guy, all of the positive things that you bring to the table, your amazing experience. So let's get into your background a little bit of what has made you prepared to be Utah's next governor.
That's a really good question. And I don't know if anybody's ever really prepared to do that, but I set out, I guess, as a CPA in my small little town, and I had kind of an epiphany after a while, very, very young. I was basically partners with my dad, who passed away a year after I showed up. So I was kind of on my own, and it dawned on me one day that there were a lot of people who needed a good accountant, and I was a good accountant. And instead of worrying about making money, I was going to try to make the community better. And I started looking at things that my little community lacked. One of them was healthcare. And so I focused on healthcare. We started a couple of businesses. One of them is now the biggest employer in the whole region, Utah Navajo Health Systems. Another one, a little air ambulance company. I didn't start it. I had a client that had a small business, and we brought in some good people and turned it into a much larger business. Went international, and now if you go to Southeast Utah, there's not a shortage of healthcare. In fact, there's an abundance of providers, and so that was good. Anyway, so that's kind of the business side of it, and then getting into politics was really just because I saw corruption, and I saw the effect of really bad policies from the federal level and what they were doing to my community, and I got involved in that and saw the same thing happening at the state level. Got in the legislature, and now looking at the governor's office, a lot of it is in response to what I think is messed up priorities in the executive that we have currently, and I can just feel that it will run so much better, and that people's lives will be better if we have policy that doesn't have special interests and corporate interests driving them.
Well, first of all, thanks for pointing out that the private sector was actually able to fulfill a need that you saw in your community, that it wasn't government that had to jump in and solve all of your healthcare needs there in Blanding. So first, thank you for pointing that out and being involved in making your community a better place as a private citizen. And I like that you do bring the experience of, being a former commissioner, being on the Utah State Legislature to really know and see the inner workings. The one thing I do really appreciate about you, and I'm small, local level, city council person here, but I tell people all the time is any level of government as an elected representative, you have immediate pressures coming. It's almost like high school where everyone wants to fit in and you're being told that, oh, you've got to do it this way. And senior leadership wants you to do this. And then if you do that for them, then they'll scratch your back in the future. And then you've got this special interest lobbyist group over here that wants you to do that. And, there's all of these influences that if you're not a really strong, principled person, it's no wonder that the majority of elected representatives who we vote in thinking they're going to do one thing and they say they're going to do one thing and then they don't do it, or they go in the complete opposite direction, which is what we witness the vast majority of the time. You have proven that you are not afraid to not be in the, quote, cool kids club as far as going along to getting along. And I so appreciate that in you. And I would love for you to maybe tell those of the audience out there who don't know some of the history of you standing up against federal overreach and the price that you and your family have had to pay for that.
Well, I'm glad you called it the Cool Kids Club. I've heard that term used a few times, and it really fits. And most people can relate to that because they have been in fifth grade and sixth grade and seventh grade, and it's funny how you get into some of these political spaces, and it feels almost like seventh grade again, like the pressures and the talking about people behind their backs and things like that, and some really good people, but the dynamics are pretty juvenile, and I guess I do feel like, and probably because of Jody, my wife, she's a very real person. There's not a lot of pretense with her. So I tell people I met Jody in the 8th grade, and I've been trying to impress her ever since, and she's not impressed by cowards. She's not impressed by juvenile activity, and so I think that honestly, I feel like I don't fit in with the Cool Kids Club, nor do I want to. And I feel like there's a much better club to be a part of, which is the serious-minded policymaker club, and that can get you into all kinds of trouble. And I always tell people, you don't get arrested and prosecuted for telling the truth or for telling a lie, you get prosecuted for telling the truth and a truth that people do not want out there. And that's kind of, you alluded a little bit to that, Michelle. And that was the case as a county commissioner, and trying to get the truth out about the narrative that the BLM had spun up in Blanding, Utah. And it was all to justify taking all of the mineral extraction in the county through means of a national monument designation. And I have my own ideas of what's behind that motivation. I think it's some large globalist interests, trying to corner the nuclear market, as well as rare earths and oil and gas, but mainly probably the uranium wealth that's in San Juan County. And so you watch those things happen, and it deserves an honest response. So as a county commissioner, that's what I started asking for, and that's when I found myself really getting on the hit list for environmentalist groups, and they did not like it. And I kept thinking, I'm just a reasonable person. I'm a mild-mannered, reasonable accountant. I just want to have these discussions, but because I was asking for the truth, they were pretty agitated. And then when we did our protest in San Juan County, and people think it was a protest over a closed road, nothing could be further from the truth. It was a protest over the whole cause of what does it mean to be a county? What does it mean to be a state? And can we be steamrolled by environmentalists who are weaponizing the Bureau of Land Management against us? Found out that they'll weaponize the Department of Justice against you as well, and the Department of Interior, and the U.S. Attorney's offices, and the media, and all those things kind of combine to create a false narrative, and you end up getting convicted in federal court, and which is what happened to me, and actually went to jail for a period of time, and later got a pardon from Donald Trump after everything was all said and done. But the idea was to teach, and in fact, the U.S. Attorney said, we want to teach these commissioners a lesson. And so I was the lesson. I was the object of the lesson, and the lesson was, to not stand up to the federal government. And for me, it only solidified the absolute necessity of standing up to the federal government, or standing up to corruption in the state, at the state level, anytime. Especially if you're going to be an elected representative, I don't see that you have the luxury of saying, you have to pick your battles. If you're telling the truth, then the fight's going to find you, and you've got to be willing to fight it every time it shows up, for the sake of the honest people in your community that might be negatively impacted if you go along with the lie.
Absolutely. And I love that you took a stand even as an elected representative. That's one thing that really frustrated me throughout 2020 on. As a private citizen at that time, I had very little involvement in the political world. I was, living my life, raising my small kids, running my business, working in the emergency department, and seeing the cowards that we had in elected office who knew better, yet were willing to take no stand against the obvious tyranny and unconstitutional mandates that were coming. It was silence. In fact, that was my campaign slogan when I was running, is silence in the face of tyranny is dangerous, because it was all about, for your safety. It's like, well, if you want to know what's dangerous, it's when we have elected representatives who are silent. So I so respect that about you, that you've proven that you are one that will take a stand, that you will truly be a voice and a true representative of we the people. That is so missing right now in the state of Utah. And I should have started this by saying congratulations, by the way, of being the Utah Republican nominee to come out of the convention. Blown away, almost 68%, right, of the vote that you received there. So you are the sole nominee coming out of that convention. In fact, you would be our governor for sure had Spencer Cox not paid his way onto the ballot. So unfortunately, we are having to go into a primary, which is on June 25th. I would love to hear from you. where you feel like we are at right now in the state of Utah, because it feels a little bit scary. I'm a hopeful person, so don't get me wrong. I'm not a doom and gloom type of person. But what we've witnessed over these last 4 years are very scary about the direction that this state is headed. And I do feel a lot of urgency. I feel like this is the most important race and election going on right now. So can you speak to that and the urgency that you sense going on right now in the state?
Yeah, I mean, well, first of all, the convention was phenomenal. I always like going to state convention myself, and being a statewide candidate, that's a new experience for me, and I was very intimidated by the prospect of, speaking to that many delegates and people that I know have done their homework, and so when I went there, and then the energy around the governor's race, it was huge, and I felt, I guess I felt that I felt like this is an opportunity, this is a time to speak up, and it went really well, really great response. Like you say, I got 67.54, so yeah, rounded up to 68% support there, which was meaningful, because those are the party faithfuls that have really studied this out. By contrast, the governor gave a speech that felt like it was designed and choreographed to blow up the convention, to create a lot of drama, that then he could come back and say, look how bad these people are, look how bad this convention is. And I think that's going to backfire on him. I think a lot of stuff that the governor's doing right now is going to backfire on him. The narrative that he's putting out there that, Phil Lyman can't win, Phil Lyman's a radical right-wing extremist. It turns out he's calling most Republicans radical right-wing extremists. And I'm just hoping that Republicans wake up and realize that Spencer Cox is not a Republican. He is a Democrat. He is close to the Biden administration, president of the National Governors Association. We're the only Republican state that's a member of Biden's American Climate Corps. I mean, the list just goes on and on. He goes back to the gridiron luncheon and does a deep toast to President Biden. He has great disdain for Donald Trump. If people would wake up and recognize that we are not choosing in this Republican primary between a Republican and another Republican, it really is a Republican in name only. That term gets overused. I just call him a Democrat, and so it's significant. And I think we're going to see a shift. I think we're going to see a change. As the ballots start to drop this June. So working very, very hard to make it happen. There's a lot of people who are so invested in this. And so I feel a lot of pressure individually, but I also feel the support of, thousands and thousands of people in Utah who are looking for a change.
Yeah, and it's interesting. You look at who funds candidates. That's often one of the first things I tell people. If you want to truly vet a candidate, just go and look at their financial disclosures, who's funding them. And as you mentioned, it's a lot of leftists, organizations who are funding Spencer Cox. So that should tell people a lot. It is not the true grassroots conservatives who are funding this guy. And another point I want to bring up, because there have been some, other commissioners throughout the state or other elected officials throughout the state who have come out and endorsed Spencer Cox. And as I've spoken to some of them to try to understand their reasoning and their logic, some of them have said, well, yeah, no, I don't agree with his social, stances. I agree he's a Democrat on these social issues, but, infrastructure and these kind of things, that those things are good. And I'm thinking to myself, I don't know if you know this, Phil, but Spencer Cox actually came down to Washington County a week or so ago and presented to our Southern Utah Home Builders Association and spoke about his housing plan, which mimics Gavin Newsom of California. So we're not talking about a social issue here. We are talking about housing and an approach to housing and, quote, affordable housing. And he essentially is coming down here and giving us a, quote, ultimatum of we have 1 year to help fix this housing crisis, this existential crisis. 1 year. That's what we've got. We've got to fix it. And, maybe you can speak to some of I think it was 74 bills that went through the legislature this past session to, quote, address affordable housing, and the $300 million that are setting aside through the Treasury to help fund developers to create, quote, affordable housing. I want to just mail Spencer Cox Thomas Sowell's Basic Economics book. I don't know if he would read it, but it doesn't seem like he really understands true free market capitalism. Can you speak to some of that? I know affordable housing obviously is a hot topic. What's your position on that?
It's really interesting to me because I was thinking about this on the drive up this morning. We're not talking about $300 million that's going to go into the pockets of Spencer's cronies that are willing to play the game, and that's exactly what's going to end up going here, because it's not like generally spread across the economy. It's going to those builders who support the effort and have demonstrated that kind of their purity test to be part of that gravy train. But if those developers would stop looking at the 300 million and look at the $250 billion economy that we put on hold for 2 years almost in Utah, and it should be a $350 billion economy and could be a $350 billion economy. What would be the benefit to them if we had a thriving, robust economy where businesses were opening up instead of shutting down? And we've got businesses that are just they're shutting down at record levels. You've got the consumer sentiment index in Utah now is lower than the national average, meaning that people are less confident in the future of Utah than they are in the future of America. It's the first time since they started doing this index that's happened. And it's because people can see that even though I may be making more on a weekly basis, it's not keeping up with my expenses, it's not keeping up with inflation, it's not keeping up with my property taxes, and they're tight. People are just really tight. And if they start looking at the next generation that's coming out of college, it's like, how are these kids ever going to be able to afford a house at 7% interest? Starter homes, starting at $350,000. The average house in Utah is $534,000 now. These things are really, really alarming, and it's so myopic to say, well, we're gonna dip into the public money, pull out $300 million, give it to a bunch of developers, and expect that that's going to fix the problem. What we need to do is stop overtaxing our businesses, stop over-regulating our businesses, back away from that, unleash the economy, and then watch things go. And I've always been more concerned about the balance in individuals' checking accounts than I have in the counties or the state's checking account. And it seems like that's a disconnect with Spencer Cox. He seems like that is his mark of success is, hey, look, we've got a $3 billion surplus at the state level. All that tells me is that we are taking way more money from people than we need. And what do we do with it? We build baseball stadiums and gondolas and, hockey stadiums, tear down downtown. Public money is not an asset. It's a liability because it gets spent on things that have to be paid for year after year after year in the future. So everything that we're doing right now, everything that Governor Cox is doing, is the wrong thing. It's taking us in the wrong direction, and people feel it. They recognize that.
I'm so glad that that's your position on that, because it's like in one breath you have Governor Cox saying, okay, you've got to fix this housing crisis or else, the state's going to come in and do it for you. So you've got 1 year, but yet in the other breath, as you brought up, you also have government saying, but we're also going to use your tax dollars to fund these billion-dollar stadiums and to help create these resort communities, and we're going to require a certain portion of your taxes to be used to market the state of Utah, which, guess what, is bringing in people here who have money, who are then buying up houses, who don't bat an eye at $1 million home because they're coming from California. There is not a resort community in the country that has, quote, affordable housing, but yet they are forcing us to use tax dollars to create these resort type communities while in the same breath mandating you have to have affordable housing. So I
Right.
like your approach of let's just get government out of the way. Let's cut the red tape. Let's let the free market do its job, do what it does best. So I appreciate you and the legislator too, oftentimes being one of very few who are willing to vote against some of these things. So I appreciate that principled approach. And one of the best quotes that I've heard from you, and if I'm misquoting you, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe it's, if you're a principled person, the fight will find you. Did I quote that correctly?
You quoted it exactly correctly. Yeah, yeah, and it's so true. I'm always amazed at you're talking about some of these commissioners that have endorsed, and I think, what are you looking at? What are you saying, we're going to get money back? I mean, I remember a meeting that I was in a few years ago, and one of the legislators, Ken Ivory, to be exact, came to the UAC, the county commissioner. I was still a county commissioner, and he said, we want to change things. So instead of relying on PILT, which is the payment in lieu of taxes that we get on federal land, that we can actually use the federal land and produce. And one of the commissioners, when he talked about his plan, the first thing he said was, "Well, what about our PILT?" And it's like saying, well, what about our gruel that we get every day in prison? What you're doing is going to threaten that. It's like, no, I'm talking about leaving prison. I'm talking about tearing down the walls of this jail that you've built for yourselves and actually living in a free Utah. And that would be phenomenal. It'd be so wonderful for our kids and for our businesses. And some of us can kind of remember that. I really feel like when I was a child, growing up in a small town, people were starting businesses, and all of the restaurants in town were like mom and pop restaurants, mom and pop hotels, and just families just trying to make a living. And some of them were doing very well. They had their cattle business. They had their little grocery stores, whatever. And the more centralized things get, the more concentrated we put all the assets into the hands of the fewer people, the worse it's going to be for all of us. And we've seen the state of Utah has just made a massive effort to centralize everything. I see these big billboards as I drive down I-15 about startup Utah. So it's now the state is a startup incubator. We have venture capital that the state's putting into businesses. It's like, what could possibly go wrong with that? And I'm saying that facetiously because what could go wrong is that if you're not willing to play by the state's rules, then you're not going to participate. In fact, somebody that you're going to try to compete against will have all the resources of the state behind them. They pick winners and losers. It is so far outside the proper role of government, the essential functions of government. But that's the product of corruption. That's when policy is made based on who's making campaign contributions. That's exactly what you end up with, is that kind of a cool kids club. So
absolutely. And you brought up something there that is key, which is families and the family unit. And that is key to a prosperous society. And one thing that has been highly concerning to me as a mom, which is my whole entrance into politics in the first place, was just being really shocked at what was being allowed to have happen to our children with the mandated masks on K through 12 schools for an entire school year here in the state of Utah. We have a governor who is using his platform as governor to declare an entire month dedicated to sexuality, which is in direct opposition of the traditional family unit and what actually has procreation and creates strong family units. Yet he's dedicating an entire month at his platform for that. We also have a governor who one of the very first executive orders he signed was related to DEI and diversity, equity, inclusion. Yet now during an election year, he seems to all of the sudden realize how dangerous DEI is and how we need to get rid of that here in the state of Utah. I wanted to ask you, so as a medical provider during COVID, and I go back to this a lot because it was a deeply personal time for me, actually losing my position in the emergency department eventually after, refusing a mandated vaccine and seeing the mandates onto our kids of the masks for that school year, which so many people seem to have forgotten about. It's crazy how short people's memories are. In fact, I've had several people, even representatives, legislators, say, "Oh, that didn't happen." Like, are you kidding me? Do I need to pull up all of these miles of evidence for you that to state that didn't happen is just beyond me. But an entire school year, and even after the mandate was lifted on the state, it still continued to be mandated in our schools. And at the time, I kept thinking, there has to be a financial reason for this. There has to be some type of a grant coming from the federal government with these strings attached, because there was not the science to back that up. In fact, I had several studies that I had sent the governor's office and many others showing that there was actually no indication to be masking kids. In fact, it was the opposite. There were known dangers and risks. So literally, it feels like Governor Cox and others literally sold the mental health and well-being of our children to the federal government for money. And who knows where that money was even used. Is this something you're familiar with?
Yeah. At the time when we were having the legislation, that basically said, we're lifting the mask mandate on everybody but K through 12. And I was trying to introduce sensible amendments to that, saying, well, we need to define what a direct health threat is, because these kids do not pose a direct health threat, so they can't be forced treated, quarantined, etc. Yet that's what we're doing. So let's at least define that. No, we're not going to define it. We're not going to talk about it. And yeah, amendment after amendment that was pushed through and defeated, and also that we could keep the kids in masks through the end of the school year. And so absolutely, that was the case. And we didn't know that was a contingency for the ESSER funds, the elementary school and secondary education relief funds that come directly from the federal government. And they have on their website, right, where they go to, which agency. These were going to the governor's office. So this is nearly $1 billion that went straight to the governor's office through ESSER funds. One of the conditions of which was that the kids remain in masks through the end of the school year. And had that been presented that way to the legislators, it would have at least put them on maybe a harder public face to say, okay, we're selling our kids mental health for $1 billion. We think it's worth it. All in favor, say aye. Instead, it was like, well, these kids are going to kill grandma and grandpa if they're not in masks. And the kids believed that. The kids were being taught that. My own grandkids, right now, I've got 6, 7, 8-year-old grandkids that are fearful of anybody with a cough, that are fearful of germs, that are fearful that they're going to bring something home to their parents or their grandparents that's going to kill their family. I mean, what a horrible, horrible thing that we did to those kids. And we did it for money. And now we can go back and we can look. Not only did we do it for money, but the money that came in, 10% of it was earmarked for DEI efforts. So all of the money that's going to the University of Utah to promote DEI, that's part of that ESSER funds. That's all contractual. It's all on the front end. It's all through the governor's office. And then that same $1 billion that's being used to fund no bid contracts, because we're under a state of emergency, of course. That's essential to be able to get to the no bid contracts. Then those corporations that are receiving the no bid contracts are the corporations that are donating to Spencer Cox's campaign fund. And it's just like, it's one of the most amazing things to sit down and go through the paperwork, and just, you think, I wonder if these guys also, made a political contribution that got this contract. You go in and it's like, of course they did, across the board. You can track it. It's like clockwork. And that's the definition of corruption. When you see that happening, that's what we're doing. And I'm sorry I'm rambling on about this, Michelle. You stood up. You saw these things. You were one of the sentinels on the wall saying, hey, this is bad. and you're being shot down, I'm being shot down. It's all a propaganda campaign. The billboards with the vaccine is safe and effective, whatever it takes to convince people that don't believe your lying eyes. What we're doing is to save grandma and grandpa, when all it is pure greed and pure graft, and spreading that money around between those big contractors.
Absolutely. And I will never forget the image of Spencer Cox with his photo wearing his mask saying, "I don't care why, wear the damn mask." I guess that was his disagreeing better of of telling all Utahns to mask up without the scientific evidence to even support that, and then shaming all of those who didn't. And speaking of the vaccine, both Deidre, the LG, and Spencer Cox, and this is well documented on video, they both supported employer mandated vaccines. They got on several times and said, businesses, we support you, and there's consequences to these unvaccinated, this pandemic of the unvaccinated. So we support you in your efforts to mandate this on your employees. In other words, you don't get to make a living for your family if you don't submit to us and get this shot that doesn't even have proven safety data to show that you should get it in all situations. So it's really disturbing to me that these are the same people running for re-election, acting like they're Republicans, acting like they know anything about liberty and freedom. What can we do, Phil? Because it's clear that you are the choice, the people's choice, the grassroots choice for governor. We are up against a machine. We are up against, a governor getting campaign funds from Pfizer while he's pushing mandated vaccines from employers. We are up against a guy who is clearly in with the establishment, with the federal administration, the Biden administration. It's not a coincidence he was appointed to be the head of the Governors Association. In my opinion, that was an ego stroke to keep Spencer Cox as their puppet going forward. There's a lot of money behind him. What do we do realistically, Phil, to get you in? Because there are many of us that are 1,000% behind you and willing to do what it takes to make this happen.
Well, I think, once people realize what's going on, then it's like seeing something that you can't unsee. Take Nomi Health, for example. This was the governor's company. He was a partner in Nomi Health. They were out, doing, multi-million-dollar contracts to other states. And then you look and you see the money that's flowing from Utah, from these funds to Nomi Health, flowing back to the governor. And things like that are things that people they've got to open their eyes. I keep saying, kind of in this fog. And if we can get the fog to lift just enough that people, open their eyes and see what's happening, I think it's going to, then I think Spencer Cox is unelectable. A guy that uses his pronouns with grade school kids, a guy that wants to appoint the attorney general, the biggest check on his power, a guy that wants to centralize all the control of the water in Utah. If people will just wake up and, recognize that a person with king-like aspirations that he's demonstrated so openly, it's like you would never put that person in a position of public trust. You would not elect them to be the governor of the state. And the other thing that we see is Utah is not just being led along this path. They're leading other states along this path. They're out in front on receiving COVID relief money and spending it in various ways, starting companies, starting these no bid contracts and things like Nomi Health and many others. We're right out in front of it.
Yeah, that education to the public is key. So if you're watching this, please, share this. Share Phil Lyman. Is it Lyman for Utah? Is your website?
FOR.
Lyman, FOR, Utah. Yes, share. Get on his social media pages. There is excellent content there. People need to be educated and informed about this election, because I'm running into people all of the time that, people have busy lives. Not everyone is actively engaged in the political world like Phil and I obviously are. So educate your neighbors. This is so, so vital. One thing that I really appreciate about you, Phil, really leading the way on here in the state of Utah, is election integrity. You are one of the few willing to speak up when it wasn't as popular, when it was really frowned upon, really, when we had our governor in LG shaming those, telling us that we are a threat to democracy if we dare question the integrity of our elections. So talk to us a little bit about election integrity, things you could do as governor. And we need to have Natalie Clausen on sometime, your pick for LG. She is phenomenal, an attorney, passionate about election integrity. What are some things there, some contrast of once we get you two into office, what changes will we see with our election transparency?
Yeah, I think a little sunlight goes a long ways. And right now, you cannot look at voter rolls. You can't look at cast vote records. You can't look at any of this information. And when I say you, I mean anybody, nobody. You can't hire a CPA firm to come in and do an audit on this. Even the legislative audit committee that comes in, there are certain things that are withheld from them that they are not able to look at, whether it's at county level or the state level. So we've got to open up those records. I want to get a Secretary of State implemented. I think inherently, when the governor essentially is over elections, because the governor and the lieutenant governor are kind of a package deal, and the lieutenant governor is over that, we've got to pull the elections out from under that apparatus and under a Secretary of State. That's going to help to open things up. Natalie Clausen has, she was involved in some really important legislation. She helped drive most of the legislation that went into, or most of the language that went into my EP037 back in 2022, which was, a really good bill dealing with, mail-in ballots and signature verification and across the board. We've got to get out of ERIC. We've got to, drop that electronic registration information center contracts. Another thing where Utah has led out getting people signed up. A lot of people wonder, can you win an election in Utah with the system the way it is? And the answer is yes, if we send the message that we're going to look at everything that we can, and there is a lot that we can look at, and that things are going to change moving forward. And then honestly, I feel like we have to, if it comes down to a coin toss, then we're going to be in trouble. We need to overwhelm the election process by public opinion in advance, getting out, talking to your neighbors, and then just a really good voter turnout, a real wave, a movement. And I feel like that's happening. It really is happening from our observation.
Yeah, we actually had a cybersecurity expert. I think his name is Mark Cook. He did a roadshow throughout Utah. I don't know if you attended any of his events, but one thing that he did say, and he's done extensive research since 2020 into all different elections all over the country, and he did say the higher turnout you are able to have, the lower the potential that they are able to manipulate results. So like you're saying, if we are overwhelming the system, showing up in force to vote, that does make it much more difficult to manipulate results. And it's unfortunate that we even have to be having that discussion or worrying about that. But when we have a current lieutenant governor who has been very less than transparent, who instead of coming out and saying, oh, okay, there's some concerns, let's address this, let's allow you all to review everything we can to make sure people feel comfortable that these elections are being run safely and securely. Instead, what do we see, Phil? We see a taxpayer-funded billboard campaign to tell us, don't worry about the elections, they're safe and secure, right?
Right. Yeah, the propaganda has just been unbelievable. And the threats, straight from the governor. You're playing a very dangerous game. You're an election denier. You're sore losers over Trump. I mean, whatever they can do to cast aspersions is like anything but, just having an adult conversation about a third party, independent, qualified person taking a look at those records and giving an assurance report on it. That's what I do as a CPA, is provide assurance services. It works for the Miss Universe pageant. It ought to work for our own elections.
Absolutely. Well, we are down to just about 30 seconds left. Please support Phil Lyman for Utah governor. Share about him on social media. Talk to all of your friends and neighbors. Share this episode. Phil, I'm going to give you the last 30 seconds here. Anything you'd like to say?
Well, I'll just say thank you, Michelle, for kind of raising the flag early on with COVID. You've been a pioneer in that. You pay attention to things, and people listen to you because you're credible, you're honest, and I really think that Utah is ready for honest leadership, and that's what we're going to bring. That's what's going to happen in June. I'm looking forward to it.
Thank you, Phil. We need you. Phil Lyman, Utah governor. Thanks so much for coming on.
Thanks for being a part of the Michelle Tanner Podcast. Please like, follow, subscribe, and share. And always remember to keep exposing truth.
But I won't back down. No, I won't back down.
This has been a production from a podcast studio.